Let's talk lifespans. Lifespans in our own world are rather boring. Whilst life expectancy has gone up almost everywhere, it's largely due to a massive decrease in infant mortality, not necessarily because humans are living longer. Much like it has been for thousands of years, humans, barring conflict or diseases, will usually live to at least 80, even more so with advances in modern medicine. And if you're lucky, or unlucky depending on what mindset you have, you may even live to 100 or a bit beyond that. But the simple fact is, we haven't yet been able to significantly postpone the inevitability that is death. On the other hand, lifespans in Middle-earth are anything but boring. Depending on what race or ethnic group you belong to, or what time period you were born in, or even depending on what deeds you committed in life, your lifespan could be wildly different, not even in just a difference of a few decades. Sometimes the variation could be centuries long. So let's get to it. An in-depth of the lifespans of the races of Middle-earth. And just as a disclaimer, feel free to listen to this video as you would a podcast, as the visual aids are rather unimportant in this video. Let's start with the easiest, elves. Yes, elves are functionally immortal. They will not die of old age or disease, but can die from grievous physical wounds, or in some rare cases, they can literally just give up and die, a power every millennial wishes they had. Because of this immortality, you have elves that have been around since the very beginning of their race, one such of these likely being Círdan, meaning they are over 10,000 years old. It's also worth mentioning that whilst death in Tolkien's universe is considered to be the separation of spirit and body, elven spirits are bound to the world, and thus can be re-embodied in the halls of Mandos given enough time. So in other words, elves such as Glorfindel can die and then come back to life. There's not really much else to say here. While we're on the topic of elves, I want to briefly talk about half-elves. This includes Dior, Earendil, Elwing, Elured and Elorin, Elrond, Elros, Arwen, and Eladan and Elrohir. As far as we know, half-elves are functionally immortal until they make the choice of which kindred they would rather be with. When they have to make that choice seems to differ depending on the individual and their circumstances, and if they choose the race of men, their lifespan also seems to be dependent on their circumstances as well. Elros chose the race of men and lived another 400 years, whereas Arwen only lived as long as Aragorn did, another 120 years. Some of the above individuals were killed before they had an opportunity to make their choice, so we'll never know in regards to how long they would have lived for. Let's move on to another long-lived race, the dwarves. Dwarves are not immortal. They can and will die of old age, but they are incredibly resistant to diseases and physical wounds, making them incredibly tough to kill. The only dwarven lifespans we receive are that of the line of Durin, and from those lifespans, it seems that dwarves generally live to around the age of 250. Although we aren't given the lifespans of other dwarven clans or dwarves of non-royal heritage, we can assume that they still live to around that same age. Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur of the Quest for Erebor are still alive during the War of the Ring, meaning they would have been over 200 at that point, despite not being of Durin's line. We also know that dwarves usually remained quite vigorous into their old age. For example, Dain II Ironfoot was slain during the Battle of Dale at the age of 252, valiantly standing over the body of his ally King Brand before finally being overwhelmed by Easterlings. Other examples are Thror, who journeyed into Moria at the age of 248, Balin, who started his Moria colony at the age of 226, and Gloin, who travelled to Rivendell with Gimli aged 235. In other words, dwarves did not spend their final years decrepit and bedridden, and death likely took them relatively swiftly. It's definitely worth mentioning that we have outliers to the average dwarven lifespan of 250. The first and most famous example is Durin the Deathless, the first dwarf to awaken. He was aptly named the Deathless because it seemed that he would not die, but he eventually did die of old age, and all we know about his lifespan is that he lived to be over 2,000 years old. It's unclear whether his direct descendants lived longer lives as well, but we do know that by the time of Durin VI, dwarven lifespans had fallen back into the normal range. The other example we have is Dwalin, Balin's younger brother and member of Thorin's company. He lived to be an astonishing 340 years of age, far longer than any of the other dwarves of his time. Some people believe this might have been an editorial mistake on Tolkien's behalf, considering no other known dwarf apart from Durin I lives beyond 270, but if you think about it, this isn't beyond the realm of possibility. Dwalin lives around 35% longer than the average dwarven lifespan. If you compare that to our own lifespan, it's no different to someone living to around 105 to 110. Rare, yes. Impossible, no. Next we have men, and this is where most of our time will be spent, because the lifespans of men, including Druidine, Hobbits, Númenóreans, Middle Men, it differed greatly. Let's start with the longest lifespans, the Númenóreans. The Númenóreans were men blessed by the Valar to longer life and greater wisdom. The first of their kings, half-elven Elros Tar-Miniatur, lived for 500 years, the longest natural lifespan of any man in Middle-earth's history. His descendants did not live quite as long as him, but did regularly live to see the age of 400. Other Númenóreans not descended from the royal line seem to have lived to be at least 200, and in some cases may have lived to be as old as 350, but didn't seem to reach 400. Númenóreans also possessed a great deal of vigour right up until the end of their lifespan, and upon feeling old age and death approaching, it was tradition to willingly lay down their life rather than cling on into old age and senility. If a Númenórean chose to cling on to life, they could live a little longer. One example of this is Taratanamér, the 13th king of Númenor, who lived to be 421. Speaking of Taratanamér, his reign is the height of the Númenórean lifespan, and as darkness fell across Númenor, so did lessen their lifespan. Following Taratanamér, Tar-Ankalamon lives to be 400, and Tar-Telemete lives to be 390. After this, the Númenóreans begin to experience a drastic drop in their lifespans. Tar-Vanamelde lives to be 360, Tar-Alcarin lives to 330, Tar-Kalmakil lives to 309, and Tar-Ardamin is the first ruler of Númenor to live less than 300 years, dying at 281. Tar-Palantir, the penultimate king of Númenor, despite repenting of Númenor's fallen ways, only lives to 220. His brother, Gamilcad, doesn't even reach 200, dying at 199, and Gamilcad's son, Ar-Pharazôn, Númenor's last king, can feel death approaching at the age of 201. The lifespans of Númenor's common folk is unknown at this point, but if they experience a decrease in lifespan similar to that of the royal line, then it's possible that they weren't living any longer than 150 at this point. However, I must mention that this rapid decrease in lifespan did not afflict all Númenóreans. The Lords of Andúni, leaders of the Faithful and descended from the royal line, maintained much of their longevity. Notably, Amandil, the last Lord of Andúni, was almost certainly older than 300 when he sailed into the west in an attempt to beg the Valar for mercy. His son, the famous Elendil the Tall, first High King of Arnor and Gondor, was slain in battle at the age of 322, meaning that he could have lived for a while longer than that. So as far as Númenóreans are concerned, their long lifespans were given by the Valar due to their faithfulness in the wars against Morgoth, but that same lifespan was taken away as the Númenóreans turned their backs on the Valar and began to turn towards the Shadow. Let's now move on to the Dunedain, the direct descendants of the Númenóreans. The lifespans of the royal line, descending from Elendil, initially started off higher than that of the Númenóreans at the end, but considerably lower than the Númenóreans at their peak. Considering that Elendil and both his sons, Isildur and Anarion, are slain before reaching old age, our first point starts with Meneldil, 3rd King of Gondor, and Valandil, 3rd King of Arnor. Meneldil reaches the age of 281, his son Kemendur 280, and his son Eärendil 276. The decline in lifespan continues from there, slowly and surely from each generation to the next. The 10th King of Gondor, Siriondil, reaches 260. The 15th King, Atanatar II Alcarin, 249. The 20th King, Eldacar, 235. The 26th King, Tarondor, 221. The 29th King, Kalimatar, reaches 200. Eärnil II, the 31st and last king of Gondor to die naturally, only reaches 160. However, it must be said that Eärnil II was a distant cousin to his predecessor Ondahur, and a direct descendant may have lived longer. The kings of Arnor see a similar decline, but they actually start from a lower point and initially decline at a faster rate. And we actually see this decline continue throughout the generations until the War of the Ring. Valandil dies at 260, the 10th king Eärendil reaches just 221, the 16th king Malvagil reaches 205, the 20th king Argaleb II 197, Araphant 24th and last king to die naturally reaches just 175. Then we have the chieftains of the Dunedain. The decline slows, but is still there. The first chieftain Aranarth reaches 168, the 8th chieftain Aragost reaches 157, and Arganui, the last chieftain before Aragorn II to die naturally, dies at 155. So as we can see, the royal lines in both Gondor and Arnor decline throughout the Third Age, and the lifespans of those of the purest Númenórean blood are living about 40% less by the time of the War of the Ring. But what about non-royal Dunedain? We have a few great examples of this, and the first and best examples are the Stewards, who despite being nobility are not actually descended from Elendil. Although we can't compare them to the kings of Gondor who died out, we can compare their lifespans to that of the chieftains of the Dunedain in the north, who lived between 155 and 168 years in that same time frame. The first steward, Mardul Voronway, lives to be 120, and his descendants have lifespans of a similar range for many generations, although this range varies. Herion, the third ruling steward, only lives to 111, yet his son, Belagorn, lives to 130. The interesting lifespan is that of Hador, 7th ruling steward, who lives to be 150. He is described as being the last of the Dunedain, at least in the south, to live that long, meaning that this may have been the initial lifespan of those non-royal Dunedain. After his death, the lifespans of the stewards bounces around a little more. Denethor, the 10th ruling steward, only reaches 102, but his great-grandson, Halas, manages 125. Belicthor, 21st ruling steward, is the last to hit 120, and after him, none of the stewards even pass 100. Ecthelion, Denethor II's father, 25th ruling steward, lives to be 98. Something similar can be seen in other lines of Gondorian nobles, the princes of Dol Amroth. Although the father of the line and not officially a prince of Dol Amroth himself, Imrasor the Númenórean, lived at the same time as Mardul Voronway, he lives to be 126. His son, Galador, the first prince of Dol Amroth, lives to be 125. Following him, we have 17 unnamed princes of Dol Amroth. The longest lived is Galador's unnamed son, who hits 143. The shortest lived is the 14th, who only lives to be 106. I'm ignoring the 2 princes who were slain in battle. Possibly owing to their elven blood, the princes of Dol Amroth actually retain slightly more longevity than the stewards. Aglahad, 19th prince, rules at the same time as Turin II, 23rd steward. Aglahad reaches 105, whereas Turin II reaches 99. Aglahad's son, Angelamir, hits 111, whereas Turin II's son, Turgon, reaches 98. Adrahil II, Imrahil's father, is actually the first prince of Dol Amroth to die before 100, only managing 93. Another example is Gilraen, Aragorn's mother. She's actually a descendant of Aranarth, first chieftain of the Dunedain, so she's still actually descended from Elendil. However, she only reaches the age of 100, similar to that of the stewards of Gondor and the princes of Dol Amroth. This is evidence that by the time of the War of the Ring, even the descendants of Elendil, unless they were either of the main line or possibly very closely related to that main line, were now barely living to be 100 years of age. So what does this say? That perhaps even as the line of kings declined, the lifespan of non-royal Dunedain maintained anywhere between 100 to 150, and it was only in the final years of the Third Age did that lifespan decline, eventually falling to around 100, only a little more than that of middle men. But why did this decline happen? It was obvious with the Númenóreans, they turned to evil, but the Dunedain did not. Well, it's because of metaphysical reasons. Morgoth's taint remains in Middle-earth, even though Morgoth himself has been thrown into the void. For the lack of a better way to phrase it, it basically means that magic is slowly declining in Middle-earth, and that everything is slowly moving towards the mundane. This is known as the Long Defeat, that basically everything in the past is better than everything in the future, and considering the enhanced lifespans of the Dunedain is basically magic, that too will decline when exposed to the gradual wearing of Middle-earth. This decline, however, seems to accelerate and sometimes reverse depending on what is happening. The initial rapid decline of the lifespans of Arnor's kings can possibly be linked to Arnor's own decline in the early years of the Third Age. On the other hand, as long as Gondor remained strong, so did the lifespans of their kings. Another possibility for decline is that of mixing with lesser men, basically anyone of non-Númenórean heritage. Although we don't have hard facts, we know decline can happen, but at least in the case of King Eldacar of Gondor, this decline did not happen due to a single generation of mixing, his mother being of Northman heritage. At the end of the Third Age, with Sauron's defeat, we see lifespans jump significantly for some people. Aragorn II would probably only expect to live until 150, yet he lives to 210. Faramir would probably only expect to live until 90 or perhaps 100, yet he reaches 120. Aragorn II's son, Eldarion, definitely lives to be older than 100, and depending on when his birth date was, he may have lived near or over 200 years old. Unfortunately, the future princes of Dol Amroth were excluded from this, and Imrahil's son and grandson lived to be less than 100. Sucks to be them. Before I move on to other men, I'll also briefly speak of the Black Númenóreans. Most of them almost certainly declined at a similar or even faster rate than that of the Dunedain, owing to their allegiance to darkness, and the fact that many of them were absorbed by native men, such as what happened to the Black Númenóreans of Umbar after Gondor captured the city. We don't really know much about them, other than the fact that at least some of them retained a lesser Númenórean lifespan by the end of the Third Age. An example of this is the mouth of Sauron, who was likely around Aragorn's age when he met him outside the Black Gate. Alright, now we move on to middle men, the Men of Darkness and the original Edain of the First Age. This is basically any group of men that aren't Númenóreans, Hobbits, or Druedain. These three categories of men are biologically the same as far as we know. They all live the same lifespans, or similar lifespans. This lifespan is similar to the average life expectancy of humans in our world, around 80 or so, and like humans, they can fall short of that average or live a reasonable amount of time beyond it. The Kings of Rohan are a great first example. The longest lived is Aldor the Old, who reaches 101, a very old age. The youngest lived is Freylaf Hildason, who lives to be 72. The lifespans of Rohan's kings don't seem to be subject to any form of natural decline, and the lifespan simply seems to come down to the apparent health of the individual, hence why Freylaf, who only lived to be 72, had a son named Britta Leofa, who lived to be 90. Although we don't know their exact ages, the Kings of Dale are very similar, also being of Northman stock. Presuming Bard was in his late 30s or early 40s when he slew Smaug, he would have died in his 70s. This is the same for his son, Bane, who probably became king at a similar age Bard did. I also want to talk about the three houses of the Edain, because they're some of the other normal lifespan men that we receive information on. The Beorians and the Merakians, also known as the Hadorians, seem to live a little longer than the Rohirrim on average, but still within the normal range of a modern human. This is when they're not dying horribly fighting Morgoth, of course. On the Beorian side of things, Beor the Old lived to be 91, and his direct successors, Baran, Boran, and Boromir, lived to be 91, 93, and 94. The fifth head of the house is Bregor, and he's the shortest lived at 89. After him, it's hard to gauge their natural lifespans, as they all keep dying in battles after this point. It's a similar situation with the House of Hador. Marak and his son, Malak Aradan, lived to be 94 and 91. None of their descendants' natural lifespans are known for much the same reasons as the House of Beor. The Haladin, however, seem to have a shorter natural lifespan, although our examples are few. Haleth, their clan matriarch, lived to be 79. The only other known natural lifespans are that of her nephew and his son, Haldan and Halmir. Haldan lived to be 85, and Halmir lived to be 81. Like the other two houses, the Haladin all start dying whilst fighting Morgoth, but unlike the other houses, they even managed to kill each other on several occasions. Many of the men of the Third Age, such as the Dunlendings, the Men of Bree, and many native Gondorians, are actually kinsfolk to the Haladin, meaning they probably have similar lifespans to them. I want to mention a small theory real quick. I believe it's possible that the Beorians and the Hadorians lived longer lifespans than the Haladin, as well as their own descendants, due to the fact that they lived in close proximity with the elves. Although it might not have magically extended their lifespan, it possibly created a better standard of living where these men could live longer, unlike the Haladin, who lived isolated in their own forests, or various Northman groups of the Third Age who had very little dealings with the elves. A group of men we can only really speculate on is the Men of Darkness, those men who served Morgoth and later Sauron. As far as I'm aware, I don't think we receive the lifespan of a single Man of Darkness. However, at the same time, there's no real reason to believe that they don't have the same lifespan as that of middle men. Although allegiance to darkness will erode blessings given by the Valar, there's no real evidence that it would erode the natural lifespan of a normal man. So men like the Haradrim, Easterlings, and Variags They probably lived a lifespan of around 70 to 90, just like other men. There's two more groups of men I want to talk about. The first are the Druidine, the Pukul men versus Wild Men of the Woods, a small and mysterious group that lived in places such as the Druidan Forest and Druef Ire, even into the Third Age. The only thing we know about their lifespan is that they lived shorter lives than that of other men. Whether this is in their nature or perhaps due to the way they live, we have no idea. Shorter lives than other men is also a pretty vague statement. So the Druidine may live to the age of 60, perhaps even 70 on rare occasions. On the other hand, they might die as young as in their 40s. We simply don't know. The other group is the Hobbits. Yes, the Hobbits are of the race of men. Hobbits are an interesting bunch because they seem to have a longer lifespan than that of other men, even longer than the late Dunedain of the Third Age. One, such as Gerontius Took, the Old Took, lived to be 130. That appears to be a relatively big outlier, although other hobbits do make it relatively close to his age. But most of his children were long-lived, even for men. 4 made it a little above 100, 3 died in their late 90s, and even those who died young, according to the hobbits, still lived into their early 80s. Across other families, this continues to be a theme. Most hobbits will live well into their 90s, and some even into their 100s. Why do hobbits live longer than normal men? Well, I'd say a lot of it is due to their stress-free lifestyle, as well as their understated physical hardiness. But there's one very small faction of men I haven't spoken about yet. The Nazgul. Yes, the Nazgul is what happens when a normal man tries to extend his lifespan beyond its nature. He eventually ends up as a wraith, not dead, but not exactly living either. So technically the Nazgul are men, that are over 4,000 years old by the time of the War of the Ring. But they cheated, and you kind of see their consequences for cheating, so I don't think it's fair to count them. That's all for men, but what about orcs? Yes, the lifespan of orcs is a point of much contention amongst the fanbase. Some claim that orcs must be immortal considering they're descended from elves, provided you subscribe to that version of events. But Tolkien mentions in his letters that orcs are not immortal, and that they're actually shorter lived than men. This makes sense, except that we have evidence of an orc, Bolg, living much longer than the lifespan of a man. Born before 2799 and dying in 2941, Bolg was at least 142 at the time of his death, well beyond the lifespan of a normal man. So this poses a problem, right? Because Tolkien must be wrong about his own work. Well, not necessarily. There's a few workarounds here. One is that when Tolkien says men, he actually means the Dunedain, who at certain points lived much longer than orcs, meaning that what Tolkien is saying was technically accurate, at least at some points. That's a little far-fetched for me. Another is that Bolg could be descended from a greater lineage of orc, perhaps a Bolldog, a fallen Maiar who took the form of an orc. If Bolg is descended from one of them, it might bestow upon him greater abilities, such as an extended lifespan. So it's possible that most orcs do actually live shorter lives than men, but some, such as Bolg, can live for much longer. What about other minor races? Ents seem to be pretty much immortal, considering Treebeard walked in Beleriand during the Elder Days. However, over time, as Treebeard puts it, some Ents have become more tree-ish, still alive, but sort of like an Ent vegetable. This may be the inevitable fate of all Ents, so unless the Entwives return, it seems that the Ents are bound for a slow, tree-ish extinction. Eagles are another one. Gwaihir, the greatest eagle of the Third Age, is said to be descended from Forondor, Lord of the Eagles, but according to the Grey Annals, Gwaihir is also alive in the First Age. That means that eagles may also be functionally immortal, or can at least live for thousands upon thousands of years. Of other evil intelligent races such as trolls and wargs, we have no idea. Spiders are a little different as far as we know. Shelob was born in the First Age and is still alive at the end of the Third Age, so this might mean spiders are immortal. However, Shelob's immortality may come from being a direct descendant from Ungoliant, and this immortality may not be common to all giant spiders. Hopefully, that's the case. As far as lifespans go, that is about it. There are other lesser-known races that appear, or are at least said to exist within Middle-earth, but we receive so little information on them that it simply isn't worth going into. I know this was an incredibly long video, so thank you if you've reached the end. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. And remember, it's not about how long you live, it's about how many cases of beer you smash in the life that was given to you.